Hello everyone, my name is Madeline Janisek and I am going to give you all a brief overview of our work entitled Performance Anomaly Detection through Sequence Alignment of System Level Traces. The main goal of this work was to first and foremost propose a precise performance anomaly detection and localization framework to assist developers in the debugging process. We wanted to make sure that our solution was manageable in that it did not require any additional instrumentation or have extensive knowledge requirements of their program's internals. But we also wanted to make sure that our method was applicable to a wide range of scenarios and technologies. And here is an overview of the proposed methodology. We start off in a data collection phase where we record execution trace data. We then extract the critical path of each execution found within that data, and we vectorize it. We then use that data to perform anomaly detection, followed by anomaly identification, and we wrap it up with anomaly localization. So like I just mentioned, we start off by collecting trace data, and trace data is just a sequence of timestamped events taken from concurrently running threads. So this can provide a very detailed picture of program or system execution, and using open source tracers, we can collect these events from multiple levels while imposing minimal overhead. The main drawback of trace data is that it's simply not feasible to manually inspect raw trace data, mostly due to the sheer number of events that can be generated in a very short amount of time, which is why there is a large body of work dedicated to the interpretation of trace data. So what we do is we collect trace data from when the program is running normally, and then we can take sample trace data from other periods and compare it against this normal trace data to look for the existence of performance anomalies. So once we have that trace data, we first break it up into individual executions. And what an execution might be is dependent on the type of software you're monitoring. So it might be a compilation time, it might be a function call, a view rendering, so on and so forth. But once we have each of those executions, we extract each execution's critical path, which is that execution's longest execution sequence. This is very helpful because it shows the interactions between threads, and it also breaks up the execution time and identifies when the execution spent its time in different states. These states being running in user mode, running in kernel mode, waiting for CPU, waiting for disk, interrupted, so on and so forth. We then take these critical paths and we create two different types of vectors. We have critical path duration vectors, which are representative of an execution's performance. This is just where each element in the vector corresponds to one of the possible execution states, and we count how long in total that execution spent in each of those states. This is primarily used to actually identify different anomalies. Count vectors are also created. They're very similar to duration vectors, but instead of representing the total time an execution spent in each of the states, it just counts the number of times that that execution entered one of those states. This is representative of the execution's critical path structure, and it's what we use to identify comparable executions. So we take that data, and then we first see if there are any indicators of anomalous performance in the sample data. So this is to determine if the subsequent steps, so anomaly identification and localization, is even necessary. We do this in two different ways. We break it up into a probability-based approach and an average-based approach. And if one of those two tests indicate that there's an existence of performance anomalies, we then go into our finer grained analysis. So when it comes to identifying which of the sample executions are exhibiting performance anomalies, we have to first acknowledge the fact that it is normal to see differences between two executions' critical paths. Even when those executions are taken from a well-functioning system that doesn't have any performance anomalies. This means that we can't take one critical path or model one critical path and say that it encompasses all of the program's normal execution behavior. So what we do is we cluster the normal executions based on their structural similarity using the critical path count vectors. We then do the same thing with the sample critical paths, and the performance of sample executions are then only compared to the cluster containing the most structurally similar cluster in the normal data. This results in a more accurate anomaly identification. So once we have our identified anomalies, we then go into our anomaly localization phase to identify the exact region that a developer or analyst should look at first. So anomalies are aligned with the cluster of comparable normal executions using multi-sequence alignment. And at each step of the aligned sequences, we determine the average state durations. So this means that we can identify abnormally long states or abnormally short states. We can also look for abnormal sequences, and then those would be presented to the user so that they can then see what was going on at that point. So based on our experimental results, which are explained in more depth in the actual paper, we are capable of distinguishing between normal executions and anomalous executions and identify potential root causes of any anomalies while imposing negligible data collection overhead. And that concludes this presentation. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask, and thank you for your time.